And thank you for that. So good morning. Good morning. Well, that's pitiful. Good morning. Good morning. That's a lot better, thank you. So it's truly an honor for me to be here. And I was enjoying myself so much this morning outside, watching people come and sign in. And then I realized how many people here I've seen at trainings or classrooms that I've visited. So it's nice to have an opportunity to reconnect a bit with some of those folks. And I want to piggyback on an observation that your superintendent made about the back of the room always fills up before the front of the room. That's okay, I have one of these cordless mics, so I can come visit you. But for those of you who chose to sit way back there, it's okay with me, but aren't you worried about the latest research? Do you know what I'm talking about? The research says the further you sit away from a presenter, the greater the degree of sexual dysfunction. People up front are smiling. Feel free to move around during the presentation. So, seriously, they've asked me to spend some time with you talking about designing environments for success for our students. And what I want to draw your attention to at the moment is the website that's at the bottom there, ravillabayridge.com. Please know that if you go to the website, there are a lot of materials, handouts available related to inclusion, co-teaching, differentiation, designing environments. So please take, use, copy, share anything that's there, okay? If it can help you or help your students. Now there is a handout that I hope was distributed to you electronically for this, but I also will make available a PDF of any of the slides that I use in this session or in the afternoon sessions for anyone who wants them. As we go through our time together, I'd like you to be thinking about what are you going to take away? What are key learnings for you? And there are three areas I'd like you to focus on. What practices that we're going to discuss and talk about are you already doing so you feel validated in terms of the work that you're doing? What are some practices, strategies, tools that we share that you could take and maybe tweak a little bit? And then what's new? So what is it that you're going to try that you haven't done before, or what is it you're going to learn more about in the near future, hopefully? So what our famed anthropologist Margaret Mead said is truer today than when she said it. She reminds us that we are now at a point where we must educate our children in what no one knew yesterday and prepare our schools for what no one knows yet. If you think about this, she's talking about the past, she's talking about the present, she's talking about the future. And we need to explore the past, present, and future of designing environments for successful learning. So we'll touch a little bit on past, present, and future. Educational historian Ripa reminds us that there's a considerable advantage in trying to understand the current situation through a historical perspective. And then we look at the past, Blake, Chip, and Lily remind us, for practically all the history of civilization, education has been for the elite, and educational practices have reflected an elitist orientation. How many groups of people had to struggle to find access to education? Our past colors sometimes our present. It influences the future. I think Lucy in this Charlie Brown cartoon articulates this very well. Sorry I missed that easy fly ball manager. I thought I had it, but then suddenly I remembered all the others that I've missed. The past got in my eyes. Past got in my eyes. How often does the past get in our eyes and impact what we're doing? We have to remember that we in education are the only people who stay in the same profession since we're 5 years of age. We have a long past. And now I'm trying to figure out why it's got its own timings. And we'll try that again. Because I'll have to talk really fast like this if I want to keep up with the way that thing is moving. And I don't really want to do that. All right. So what about the present? For us, the present is about schools being more inclusive, welcoming greater diversity than ever before. For me, inclusive education is a philosophy and a practice where we welcome, we value, we empower, and we support the diverse academic and social, emotional, language, and communication learning of all students. Primarily, we do this in shared environments and shared experiences because we believe it will better enable them to achieve the desired goals or outcomes of education. Has the past influenced the work that we're doing in terms of welcoming, valuing, empowering, and supporting diverse learners? Well, I want to just take a minute and think about inclusion of children with disabilities here in California. I moved to California in 1996, and when I got here, nationally, 47% of students with disabilities were in general education settings 80% or more of the time. In California, we were ahead of the nation. We had 50% of students. Interestingly enough, here we are today, and nationally, we've made great progress. A little over 61% of students with disabilities are spending 80% or more of their day in general education settings. But we haven't changed from the past as a state. We're still at 50%. What impact does this have? Well, the U.S. Department of Education has noted concern with the academic performance of students with disabilities in California as compared to other states. We've got 40 years of research and experience that has demonstrated that academic and social success is greater in general ed settings than in resource rooms, special class, special schools. And we also know that in terms of adult life, happiness, friendship, self-esteem, and employment all increase in direct proportion to the amount of time our students are spending in general education settings. I believe that past practices have colored the present. Our task today is no different than it has been at any other time in education. Our task is to provide an education for the kinds of kids we have, not the kinds of kids we used to have, want to have, or the kids that exist in a dream. They're there. It is always an honor for me to be able to spend some time with teachers, with educators. And by the way, as a former union president and chief negotiator, I like the way that the union was introduced as leadership personnel as well. As teachers, I've got a question for you. How important are you with respect to your student success? What percentage of the difference in student achievement do you think is attributed to teacher expertise? Take a minute and talk to somebody next to you. How important do you believe teachers are? What percentage of the difference in student achievement do you think is tied to teacher expertise? And then if there's anybody who's got a sense of how I can make this timing stop, I'd be happy. You talk to your neighbor. What difference do we make? I don't know. Didn't do it when I was practicing. I don't know why, I just appreciate the slideshow. Finish up that thought. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Oh, I like that because I don't have to stay right up there. So yell it out for me. What do you think the answer is to that? What percentage of the difference in student achievement is tied to the expertise of the teacher? 80? 50? 25? 25? 10? We have some diversity of opinion. However, the answer is that you are very important. Your expertise accounts for 40% of the difference in student achievement. That is greater than any other factor. That is more important than primary language of the student, perceived ability, disability, life circumstances. You have the greatest impact with your expertise. Today, that expertise has got to be considering an increasingly diverse group of students, and we've got to create environments that are going to support these learners who learn in various ways. When I think of designing an environment for student success, you have to think about designing it at 4 different points, 4 different variables. The first one is, in order to design the environment, we have to gather facts about our learners. And with that in mind, we have to figure out how to differentiate content and materials, products and assessment, and the processes of learning. So we're going to spend a little time journeying through those 4 design points. I do want to make reference to this particular website, and you have this in the handout that accompanies the presentation on page 2. And it relates to a federally funded project I have in the state of Kansas. And you will find technology, web-based resources that will help you to design those environments. And they touch all the dimensions, gathering facts about the learner, differentiating content materials, products and assessment, and processes of learning. You also, if you go to my website and you go to the topical area differentiation of instruction, you will find additional web-based resources in those dimensions. So if the first design point is gathering facts about the learners, let's focus our attention there for a little bit. Why would we gather facts about our learners? Hall tells us that differentiation of instruction is a way for teachers to recognize and react responsibly to the students' varying background knowledge, readiness, language, I would add culture, learning preferences, and interests. What Hall is saying is you can't really begin to meaningfully differentiate instruction, especially for the students who might be struggling, unless you've gathered facts about your learners. So take a minute and think about the various ways you gather facts about the learners. Share that with someone seated near you, and be prepared to share with me if I call on you to fulfill my Jerry Springer fantasies. All right? What are the various ways that you gather facts about your learners? Talk to a neighbor. Yes.
Listen to them talk to each other.
Okay, so you're observing this and yes?
It's offering choices.
Oh my gosh, choices, okay. Again, you're seeing what to do, yes ma'am.
Ask the parents about their child.
All right, so we can interview parents. So your answers are fairly common. Again, I want to remind you of that website because the answers we typically get are observations, surveys, interviews, inventories, record reviews, summative formative assessments. So if you go to the first website that's there, and you'll have access to various learning style assessments, multiple intelligence assessments, some different surveys that are being used. I would add that if you have a child who is struggling, it's great to observe them, obviously, where they seem to be having a problem. But if there's a place where they are doing well, whether it's academic and or behavior, you're going to gather a lot of very important information observing them in the environment where they're doing well. And when we talk about interviews, you're right. We can interview the students, we can interview the parents, we can interview former teachers, classmates, siblings, etc. Nice. So, that second design point is about content. And this is a multi-dimensional design point because it's going to focus on what is it that we're teaching, what's our standards that we're addressing, objectives, to what level of knowledge or proficiency we're expecting students to demonstrate, and of course, what materials are we going to use. So we're really asking, how are you planning to differentiate in terms of content, materials, levels of knowledge or proficiency? So how hard is this for you?
Kind of.
Kind of? Wait, you haven't seen anything yet. Okay, so what I want to do is share with you a couple of brief clips. One will be from elementary, one will be from high school. And this is what I want you to be looking for. So what is it that they are teaching? Are they differentiating levels of knowledge or proficiency? Are they differentiating the materials? We'll start with kindergarten from here in California, Woodland Hills.
When we're focusing on the ending sound, the touching portion of it, that's phonemic awareness, so the point is to hear. So they're going to touch alongside, and if they need some redirection, the adult can help them touch and model for them. However, when we're moving to the end, I know for Luciano, for example, we're working on letter matching. I believe we are for Manny and Nico as well, but with color coding.
Right.
Yes. For the students who are working on color matching, maybe the T, or the ending sound, excuse me, would be in another color, like red.
For Chloe, I'd like to see the adult just have a tactile letter and show her which, this is the D, this is the T.
Yeah.
Cat ends with T, right, and show me which is the T.
Scaffold based on what their need is, come up and show them, find the D, and cover up 2 letters. Have them point exactly the choices and then have them guide them to putting the highlighter to on.
For Chloe, I know she needs the tactile, is that right, Sherry? So she is going to be able to feel the O, see what it feels like, and it's also a very high contrast color for her. I know she needs that visually. And so then her choices, the correct one will also have the same texture as the O that she needs to be matching. O's on the top, so they're able to feel the O's as well, see what it feels like, and then after they complete the activity, they'll be able to finger paint over the O's as well, just like everyone. And then they have their letter choices. The correct ones match the color boxes because I know they're color coding right now. We have an extension activity where they will be, all the students will be coming up with O words on the octopus. And
Oh, good, I see you on this one, you left the letter blank so that the expectation would be for that student to go ahead and write that.
Yes, because he is able to do the writing himself.
How many do you think? You're very good guess. Without counting, just kind of looking at it and making a
Very good guess. How many? 18. All right, then that is your estimation. So on the line that says estimation underneath your guess, right, 18.
I looked up 1 and 8.
That's right, a 1 and an 8. That's exactly right. Okay, Cassandra, you need to make your estimation.
So take a minute, talk to somebody near you again. And in terms of that, and their planning, there are 3 kindergarten teachers and a special educator planning. The special educator co-teaches with 2 of those kindergarten teachers, but they're planning and differentiating materials for students in the co-taught class as well as the other class. But what did you pick up in terms of differentiation? Talk to a neighbor, please. And finish up that thought. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So, very big little piece of them in the planning meeting. But were you able to see or pick up any differentiation that they were implementing or planning? Can you help me figure it out? Your head's nodding yes.
Just multiple ways of learning, tactile, color coding.
Okay, so you notice multiple ways that they were trying to facilitate access to the content. So some kids have tactile, some kids are doing color coding. Anything else? Yes?
They specifically named students they were talking about?
They were specifically naming students, for example, for Chloe. So obviously they had facts about their learners. They knew that certain learners were going to need different kinds of supports, materials to facilitate learning. Any other thoughts, observations, questions? Let's move then to a high school classroom. And when you are looking at this classroom, this is from Pennsylvania, this is Jane Swan. I want you to try to figure out what is the goal, the objective here, and how is she doing differentiation of content and materials. Talk to me a little bit about how you differentiate the process of learning. Sorry, that'd be the wrong clip. And it's coming. All right, so what is the content she is teaching? Wouldn't you love for me to put you in one of my videos? Poor Kathleen has become famous, mostly because she's right as we switch to Jane. I'm always indebted to anyone who lets me visit their classroom. I'm incredibly indebted to anyone who lets me come in with a film crew. Okay, so as we meet Jane, some of what I want you to get, you're going to hear, some of it you're going to see. But what is the content, the objective? Is she differentiating levels of knowledge or proficiency? Is she differentiating materials?
Focus on basic skills, reading, writing, mathematics. We try to have a variety of reading materials. We offer
That's not what I want.
differentiated materials. For example, sometimes we'll highlight some of the harder science terms for some of the students with the lower reading skill.
Come on. There, right?
Tools that help them do the work, so it really leads to independence.
Well, I vary the materials for them. First, access their prior knowledge, wanted to know exactly what did they know about bias. And what I found out is that some of them had no idea, but that once people started sharing, we had that. And then we had different articles from different magazines. I had different newsprint available to the kids so they could look for things. And I also had text-to-speech software that helped some of the kids that may process things a little slower. So that helped.
When you get to the articles, you had two different groups, each assigned an article from Teen Newsweek.
Correct.
They all were asked to read the same article.
In those groups. The one group read one called On Defense, and then the other one read about kids under pressure.
And were they at different reading levels?
Actually, those kids within the groups were. Yes, they weren't all the same. They were still heterogeneously grouped. So that some of the kids that might have a little more difficult time, for example, with the one with immigration, because that's a little tougher than kids under pressure and doing too many activities, that I was guaranteed that there was somebody in that group that could help somebody else.
Now, the group that was working with the newspapers,
Yes.
they were not all assigned same, so they had more choice.
They had a lot of choice. That group itself probably was a pretty quick group, and I knew that they could go in and find bias without too much of a problem, that they could look at something and identify it pretty quickly, skim through and find different articles, and they did. Put it up on the computer for the kids, they had paper, I scaffolded some of the notes. There was actually a word bank down there so that if they weren't quite following along with me, they could also add the words in there, which was very helpful. Another thing that I didn't do, that I would have done had there been a couple of the other kids in the class, also made access to the computers to a program called Inspiration, where they could then develop their own web, something like that, to help them remember what bias was.
Okay, please, talk to a partner. What did you see? What is the standard? What kind of content material differentiation was she making? Up that thought. Thank you. So, what was her content objective? You can either volunteer or just call it out. Detecting bias in literature. Did she do any content material differentiation? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay, so help me understand. What did she do? Tell me one thing she did. Okay, for some students, she had them using text-to-speech software, right? And I love her languaging because she'll say, for those kids who process things a little more slowly. She's basically talking about the students who could not read the content she wanted them to read. But if you give them text-to-speech software, it highlights the passage, it reads it to you. It's built in most operating systems for Mac and other computers. So how many groups did she have? 2. Anybody think more? I've heard 1 and 2 and more. So help me understand what the groups were. What was one group doing? All right, well, let's go to hands so I can hear one because it's different things. Why, thank you. Any movement tells me you're volunteering. Can you tell me what one of the groups was using?
One was using magazines, another was using newspaper articles. and-
Okay, so he mentions magazines and he mentions newspaper articles. So how many groups were working with magazines? 2. One group was reading about kids under pressure, the other group was reading about immigration, kids on the fence. Do you think we might have some difference in terms of the sophistication of concept, vocabulary, etc. within those? And you already told me there was a group using text-to-speech software. And then our colleague back here says some were doing newspapers. Were the kids who were using the newspapers assigned an article? No. Are we making any assumptions about the students in that group? So we might assume that they're higher level, but did she not say that all the groups were heterogeneous, mixed ability level? So it might be puzzling unless you walk over there and look at the newspapers. She has a range of papers with different readability levels, from the local Gazette to the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer. So she's varying the materials. But what those kids had in common was the ability to work independently, to stay focused, to find the material and be able to share. Even the group that was using text-to-speech software, there's a student assigned there who could very easily read the material she wanted that group to have. So when they access it through text-to-speech and come back together, that person's a built-in resource if they want to go back and find something quickly or check it. Did you notice any other ways that she was differentiating the content and the materials? The piece of paper that she had, right, was structured notes that some students might need. And for some students, she adds word banks. For other students, she talks about the use of graphic organizers from Inspiration or Kidspiration. So just a little quick view of one class in her life. I will say that every time I went into her class, any day I went into her class, she had multiple ways that she was differentiating content, products, and processes for the learners. But she was on her journey for quite a while in doing this. So we know that we've got to gather facts about our learners through all the different sources that you talked about. And we know that we use that information to differentiate content material. Now I have a question for you, and I'd like an honest answer. How many of you, when you were looking at either of those clips, were thinking about the number of different students you see over the course of the day? Any of you kind of thinking, but I see 100, 130, 150, 180 different kids a day. So can we sit and plan for every one of them by name? Sometimes people will say to me, well, you know, if I had one Chloe, one Maria, I could do this. But I have all these different learners, and many of them are struggling. Do you expect me to do this for all of them? On some level, of course, our answer should always be yes. But I'm not dismissing how difficult that is. So what makes it difficult sometimes is that what we're trying to do is to fit increasingly diverse learners into something that was never designed with them in mind. Those of you who I spent some time with talking about differentiation before, we talk about 2 approaches to differentiation. One is known as a retrofit, and the other is universal design. Both of those terms, we in education borrow from architecture. So the architectural analogy helps us understand this. If I have a school building built in the 60s, was it built so everyone could access it? Could we make it accessible today? Right? We're going to do a retrofit. We're going to remodel to take what currently exists that is inaccessible and make it accessible after the fact. After the child has been unsuccessful, after we have been unsuccessful, rather than send the child someplace else, to borrow from what you were talking about earlier with the superintendent. We learn from failure, and we're going to remodel it. So that school, we're going to widen the doorway, put in ramps, change the bathroom configuration, add an elevator. In education, when the student is not being successful, then we're going to remodel our content differentiation, product differentiation, or process differentiation. And we have to gather facts about the learner. But today in architecture, Architects follow universal design principles. Before they build something, they try to think of the wide range of people who might need access and develop something that will be universally accessible for all, right? I feel that a lot of our nation's teachers are in the retrofitting business because we're trying to fit more and more diverse kids into something that was never designed with them in mind. So oftentimes people try to get into that more proactive, universal design thinking. And they like to use frameworks. Now in your handout, if you have access to it, you've got this multiple intelligence pizza on one page, and then you have several pages where it talks about the different intelligences and what learners who have these kind of strengths and intelligences might like as activities. You can use multiple intelligence theory. It's just one framework, but again, it tends to be the one I see most often used for people. You can use it in terms of the content dimension, the product dimension, and the process dimension. Now, there are 8 intelligences there. I'm sure many of you know this comes from the work of Dr. Howard Gardner at Harvard University. Gardner was long interested in the construct of what is an intelligence. So he set out to define it and discover how many kinds there might be. He originally said there were at least 6, then he said at least 7, then he said at least 8, and he's been debating the presence of a 9th for quite a while. But it doesn't meet all of his criteria. Out of all those intelligences in that pizza, what are the 2 that we most value in school? Word smart, verbal linguistic, and mathematical logical, correct? So if I do well in those 2 areas, I do well in school. But if my strength lies elsewhere, you might even call me disabled, when in reality I am simply differently abled. We all have all of them, but in a different proportion, different profile. Where are your top 2? How many of you would say that one of your top 2 strengths is that you're word smart, verbal linguistic? Thank you. Mathematical logical. Picture smart, visual spatial. Quite a few of you. How about motor movement, bodily kinesthetic? Musical. How about a naturalist, nature smart? How about people smart, interpersonal? So you think. How many of you believe you are intrapersonal, self-smart, reflective? We're all here. Now this is a fairly big-sized group, but even when I have a small group, when I ask people where are your top 2 intelligences, I pretty much get hands for every one of them. Why would people be attracted to this to help them plan, to design an environment that will be successful for all? Because you make the assumption that all of these learners are already in your class, learners who learn this way. And you try to figure out how can I use these intelligences to help the students get the content, make sense of their learning, and show me what they know. We are going to make sure that we exercise all of the intelligences for all students, but we're going to primarily emphasize word smart, logic smart, but maybe not initially for the students who don't learn that way. Multiple intelligence theory has advantages for every child in the room, but it has added advantages for the child who struggles in learning. Let me try to illustrate advantages for all. By the way, I don't know what you did, but Siri is really mad at you. She's not talking to you. So you can't use a smartphone, you can't use a GPS, but you need to get from here to someplace else, someplace new. You've got to rely on old kinds of resources. So you have a choice of 3. How many of you needing to get from here to go to someplace new would say, give me the map? How many of you would say, no, give me the written directions, like step by step by step? How many would say, no, tell me and point out the landmarks? So we have some preferences, and it might help us to get there if we use those resources. However, don't you believe we can increase the likelihood everyone will get from where they are to where we want them to be if they all get the map, the written directions, and the oral directions? In a nutshell, that's the essence of using learning styles or multiple intelligence theory. We are trying to increase the likelihood students get from where they are to where we want them to be because we give it through a variety of modalities and intelligences. Here is your kicker for the child who is struggling to learn. If they are not smart in the way that we need them to be in that class, then we are going to find out how they are smart and help them initially get it that way. And once they've got it, then we can build upon that success. I can give you a personal example. I don't know if I shared this with groups in the past, but I did fairly well in school until I got to geometry in high school. Now, when I asked you, where are your top intelligences, you told me, and I asked you, do you want written directions, oral directions, and a map? You could give me all three, and it would be a crapshoot if I'm going to get there or not. My least developed intelligence is visual spatial. I have terrible sense of direction. I can be in the same hotel room for a week, and every time I open the door, it's a new adventure. It's really kind of pitiful the way, but nonetheless, I get there. You know the stereotype, men will not stop and ask for directions. It's not true for me. I like people, I talk a lot, I stop getting new directions. They're quickly out of my head, I'm lost again, meet new people. So imagine, given that self-disclosure, how I did when I got to geometry. I couldn't figure out what happened to me. And I kept going for help after school, and I had a wonderful teacher. She put a lot of extra time into me, but I know there were times she tried to get out of there before I got there. I know, but I was fast. And then my favorite was the day she said, "Dear, you just don't know how bad I feel to keep giving you such low grades when you obviously care and you're trying so hard." My response was, "Well, I don't want you to feel bad. Give me better grades." She taught me. I didn't get it. Why? She kept reteaching it in the same way. If I were going to get it that way, I would have gotten it. She didn't know any better. I didn't know any better. And I will be honest with you, as an administrator for years, my least favorite class to go into was a geometry class. Because I'd go in there and I'd have all this negative transfer, even after all those years and all those feelings. And therefore, it became my favorite class to go into. Because it would make me stop and think. I had mostly great experiences in school, but look what I still feel. And it made me think of the students who struggle many days, many years, with many different teachers and classes, and make me more empathetic, if you will. So, I'm glad I didn't stop going into geometry classes, because I went into a geometry class as an administrator, and the kids were learning theorems through song. And as an adult, it was like, I wasn't stupid. I could have learned this if it had been taught in the way that I learned. For years in education, we've had an axiom that children do not learn the way we teach the way they learn. But we haven't known how to do that until we have frameworks like learning styles, multiple intelligences. So, on my website, under the topic differentiation of instruction, there are also multiple MI surveys that you can use. But there is one that I would like to assign to you for extension, enrichment, if you choose. There's one called the MI Teacher Survey. The Multiple Intelligence Teacher Survey is asking you, in all these different areas, which of these practices do you use in your teaching in a typical week? Never 1 a day, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Why would I want you to do that assessment? Okay, help us pay attention to what we're doing. I believe that you will discover that most of us teach from our strengths. We teach the way we like to learn. So if we have students whose profile matches ours, good year. But what if it's the inverse of ours? Not only should it give you a snapshot of who you're reaching really well right now, but it may give you some ideas on how do you begin to broaden your repertoire and meet some of those students who might still be struggling. The second most frequently used framework that people use to think in advance of building in multiple avenues, if you will, for students to get the content, or to make sense of it, or to show what they know, is Bloom's taxonomy. This is the way we learned it. You remember this from Psychology 101? Bloom and his colleagues in 1956 told us that there was a hierarchy of thinking, 6 levels of thinking. At the time, Bloom and his colleagues said 80% of what we ask students to do in school is from the lowest 2 levels, knowledge and comprehension. The most recent research I saw on that a few years ago was that 96% of what students are asked to do in school is at knowledge, comprehension, and application. I know that's not true in many of your classrooms, but there is certainly that emphasis to push kids into higher level thinking. So this is the way we learned it, with knowledge being the lowest level, because that's good when you're going to memorize, name, list, match. Comprehension is demonstrating an understanding, oftentimes in your own words, give it meaning. And that applies to take this knowledge and do something with it, to solve. Analysis is compare, contrast, similarities and differences. Venn diagram is a great example. If we were to categorize, classify things by phylum, by species, if you will. Synthesis was to invent, to imagine, to prescribe, to create. And the highest level of thinking they believed at the time was evaluation, where we are going to form opinions and defend, justify, argue for it. Since about 2004, most people have decided that they're going to switch those top 2 levels. That synthesis is a higher level of thinking than is evaluation. Some people add metacognition at the top, thinking about your thinking. What I find is a useful visual for this is the nested Bloom's taxonomy. And you have this in your handout with a little different visual representation on pages 7, 8, and 9. What I like about this representation of it is we've got the levels of thinking by what we're asked to do. Remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And you've got the verbs on the right, which are going to be the actions. And on the left, you've got various products that would demonstrate that level of thinking. A caution that I have about how people use this is that if you're going to use this, try not to say, well, these kids are just going to do lower level thinking, knowledge and comprehension. Rather than that, differentiate in what actions they take, what products they produce, because all kids should be given opportunities to engage in higher level thinking. Again, they happen to be the 2 most frequently used frameworks that I see people using. In your packet, there's also a list of strategies that are frequently used to support English language learners. Now, you may have English language learners, you may not. But whether you do, you don't, it isn't important, because there's absolutely no research that says that there's a set of instructional practices that only work with students who have a particular label. Good teaching is good teaching is good teaching. So strategies that support English learners could support many students in a class. So some of our teachers will look at that list and will be thinking, which of these strategies do some students need? Which can I use for many students that are in the class? In your packet, you also have another way people differentiate levels of participation in content. And they're described. And the 4 are here. We start at the top, we go down as far as is necessary. So if all your students can do the same thing in the same way, at the same rate, at the same time, do it. Put your feet up and get a caramel frappuccino, because you're not going to get many of those days. But there are going to be many times when they can't all do the same. So you may do the same with minor modifications, we've done that forever. Or you might think about multi-level participation. In multi-level participation, all students work in the same curriculum area, but they're working at different levels. So we see this when we have leveled reading, guided reading, where students are reading content at the level where they can read it. But there are many moments for heterogeneous interaction with diverse learners, because when they're talking about the theme, the plot, story elements, they can interact with one another. Whoops. right? In a math class, there are often sub-problems within a problem. So I was in a class where most of the students could do division, but some students were doing subtraction. They paired the students who could do division together, and they alternated the role of problem solver and verifier. So you solve all the odds, you solve the evens. You solve one, you verify it's correct. You solve two, you verify it's correct. What were they doing with the learners with subtraction? Were they in a separate group? No, they had them with a partner who could do division. Well, how they proceeded was different. The learner who could do division took the lead on every problem, but are there not sub-problems of subtraction within division? When it came to the sub-problem, the learner who could do the subtraction did it. In the other partnerships, they rotate the role of verifier. In this partnership, the student doing subtraction always was the verifier through the use of a calculator. If you cannot do multi-level participation, then they begin to think about curriculum overlap. How are we going to overlap or integrate this child's unique set of goals into what the rest of the students are doing? So I have an English language learner in that math class. Can I overlap English language learning into math? Can I? Sure. It's going to be through story problems, word problems. They probably don't exist in the book because we're working with controlled vocabulary, so we develop it or students develop it. Some of you who are with me would have heard an example here of curriculum overlapping when we talk about students with more significant pervasive support needs, students who are considered moderately to more severely disabled. They can be in gen ed classes if we can figure out ways to integrate, overlap their objectives into what everyone else is doing. In that decision-making framework, the last thing you do is alternative, right? And one other resource in your packet about content differentiation is thinking about different levels of contribution. It can be thematic in that we all work on the same thing, but we're not necessarily sharing. It can be social, where we arrange our students so they work in partners or groups. It can be contributing, where we're going to have them contribute what they're working on. Sometimes it's unique contribution, where we pre-teach, set kids up to give them something that they can contribute to the class. People like various frameworks. So what I want you to do when you have a chance is to look at that handout, because most of you don't have it, and think about which of these frameworks could help you broaden what it is you are doing with the students that you have. Could you learn more and practice more and think about the multiple intelligence theory, Bloom's revised taxonomy, incorporate more strategies to support students learning English for the benefit of many. We could look at layered curriculum, levels of participation, contribution, options. That's a nice sound. Design 3. Let's do design 3 and then we'll give you a break before we go to design point 4, because that's the huge one process. This design point describes how learning is going to be evidenced in how it's going to be measured. It is about what they produce and how we assess it. And here is where you're not having the packet or the materials available to you is a little bit of a hindrance for the visualization of this. But why don't we take a moment before I talk to you about integrating a couple of frameworks and creating product differentiation menus to have you do the brainstorm here like you did earlier. What are the different ways you allow students to show you what they know? How do you differentiate products in your teaching? Please share with one another and then be prepared to share with me. finish up that thought. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So can I have some helpers again? What are various ways? I heard earlier that you allow choices as a way to learn about students. And how do you provide some choice of options for them in products? All right, thank you. Verbally versus written. That it?
We do a lot of movement. My classrooms all like act out the answer instead of typing it.
Okay, so they do a lot of movement in their class, so they may be able to act it out instead of always having to write it out. So I've got verbal versus written. We've got movement. Yes, ma'am. Okay, signals. So it could be I agree, I disagree, I'm not sure, it could be Italian, Lunette's ends. Right? There are a lot of variety of signals that they can get, so they can tell us more than that. Is that it? Technology. Okay, so whether they're going to record themselves. Teach someone else. Hi there. Anybody else have another example of how you do product differentiation? So, the door prize goes to David Peck, District Music. Let you see what you get. It's incredible. All right. What were the two frameworks I said people most often use to try to help them differentiate? Tell me, man. Multiple intelligences and fluid. You don't have to use those two. But it dawned on us if those are the two that are most frequently used, were we able to integrate them and create a template for product differentiation menus? So if you go into the packet, you won't have this on page 13. You'll begin to look at a product differentiation menu. So if you don't have this, you got to visualize a graphic organizer or template. Going down the left, you have the 8 multiple intelligences. Going across the top, you have 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. At the intersection of each multiple intelligence and each level of thinking, we try to come up with a product that students could do to show us what they know. In your packet, I gave you one from when I was teaching high school government. So when the students came in, we began a unit on the Constitution. I did a pre-assessment. What do they know? And then I let them know, of course, they were going to have the traditional unit test. But then they had to pick 3 products at a minimum from the product differentiation menu. If you look at it, you will see I wasn't smart enough to fill in every cell, but there are a lot of different cells filled in at the intersection of a level of intelligence and level of thinking. What I did say, though, is they had to do at least 3 products. One had to be done alone, one had to be done with a partner or a group, and the third one was their choice. They could do it alone, with a partner, or a group. The other teacher criteria or parameter was only one could be from lower level thinking, knowledge, comprehension, and application. The other 2 had to be from higher level thinking, analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. So, how many products did they have to do? 3, right? And what were the other parameters that were set around this? One had to be done alone, one had to be with a partner or a group. Third one was choice. And there's another parameter. Only one from lower level thinking. Now that's general, but there might have been some kids where I closed out the option of any lower level thinking, right? And I mean, you can still, even what they were asked to do, you can play and differentiate that. Now let's say, in terms of multiple intelligence theory, I have a learner who is an intrapersonal learner, who is self-smart. How are they going to choose to work initially? Alone, partner, or group? And next, what are they going to do? They're going to take their choice, and it will be to work alone. And then finally, what will they do? A partner or a group? Partner. Let's say I've got someone who's highly verbal, frequently found in conversation with peers. How is that learner going to choose to work initially? And how is she going to choose to work next? Group, group, and then she'll work alone and complain about it and talk to everyone seated around her. So I put all my intrapersonal kids there so they will ignore her. But in reality, if you think about how they have both gone through this process of learning, they both have the opportunity to learn first from strength, second from strength, and then they were exercising a non-strength. They're still going to take the traditional unit test. So sometimes people say to me, well, you know, when you do all this variation with products, that's not going to help them when the real test comes. But for a lot of kids, using multiple intelligence theory learning styles increases the likelihood they have something when they get to that real test. They still get plenty of practice taking those kinds of assessments along the way. So you might find that product differentiation menu helpful in terms of what you're doing. When we started, I asked you to be thinking about these key learnings or takeaways. Have you heard anything that validates what you're already doing? Have you heard some things that you're like, I can think about that and go back and tweak? Have you heard anything that you're like, well, something else for me to try? At a minimum, I've got to look at the handout and see what he's referencing, and or here's something I want to learn more about. Take a minute and talk to a neighbor. Address any of those areas. The more you address, the better. All right? Take all the time in the world you need. You have 2 minutes. And please finish up that thought. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So in a minute, we're going to take a break. When you return after 15 minutes, we're going to go to probably the largest, biggest, most complex design point, which is instructional processes. It is huge because it's going to include all the various instructional formats you might use, the various instructional arrangements. What instructional strategies are we going to use? How do we design, differentiate the social environment, the physical environment, And then what about people who are teaching? Are we collaboratively teaching? Are we employing co-teachers or students in a more, a stronger role in terms of collaboration, helping for themselves and for others? So, with that said, why don't we try to be back in 15 minutes?